Most betrayals don't begin in bedrooms. They begin in conversations no one thought mattered. A laugh held a second too long. A message replied to a little too fast. By the time boundaries are broken, the heart has already crossed them. Before we go deeper, let me ask you this. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your country or city in the comments. 1. Emotional cheating begins with attention, not physical contact. Long before hands touch or bodies cross a physical boundary, something far more powerful has already shifted. Attention is the first currency of intimacy, and where attention consistently goes, emotional bonds quietly follow. Most people underestimate this because attention feels harmless, it feels polite, it feels normal. After all, talking is not cheating, listening is not cheating, laughing is not cheating. But attention is never neutral. It carries intention, energy, and priority, even when no one consciously admits it. At first, the shift is almost invisible. It starts with curiosity. A conversation that feels lighter than usual. A person who seems to get it without explanation. Someone who listens without interrupting, without correcting, without demanding. Attention feels good when it's effortless, and that ease is what makes it dangerous. There is no alarm bell for emotional attention. There is no social rule that says you must stop enjoying being understood. And so the door opens quietly, without resistance. Attention grows through repetition. One conversation becomes two become routine. Routine becomes expectation. When someone starts looking forward to a specific person's messages, opinions, or reactions, attention has already crossed from casual to emotional. It's no longer random. It's selective. And selection is the moment where emotional loyalty begins to split. The mind starts associating comfort, validation, and excitement with a source outside the primary relationship. What makes this especially subtle is that attention often shifts during moments of vulnerability. Stress, boredom, loneliness, or feeling unseen create emotional gaps. Attention fills gaps faster than commitment ever can. When someone else notices details your partner overlooks, remembers things your partner forgets, or responds with empathy instead of solutions, the emotional brain takes note. That attention doesn't just feel pleasant, it feels necessary. And necessity breeds attachment. The brain doesn't distinguish sharply between emotional and physical intimacy. Neurologically, feeling understood activates the same reward systems as feeling desired. Dopamine responds to anticipation. Oxytocin responds to connection. Over time, attention from the same source begins to carry emotional weight. The person becomes emotionally significant, even if the relationship remains verbally platonic. This is why people often say, "Nothing happened," because in their mind, nothing physical validates the shift, but emotionally, everything already has. Attention also creates comparison, even when unspoken. When someone starts receiving focused attention elsewhere, interactions with their partner are subconsciously measured against it. Conversations at home feel heavier. Responses feel slower. Emotional exchanges feel less rewarding. The partner hasn't changed, but the baseline has. Attention elsewhere raises emotional expectations, and the relationship starts to feel like it's falling short without knowing why. Another critical aspect of attention is privacy. Emotional attention thrives in spaces where it isn't witnessed. Private messages, inside jokes, late-night conversations. These aren't problematic by default, but they become significant when emotional openness is reserved for one person and withheld from another. When someone starts sharing frustrations, dreams, fears, or daily details with someone outside the relationship before sharing them with their partner, attention has already realigned. Emotional priority has quietly shifted. Attention also rewires emotional habits. Instead of turning toward a partner during stress, the mind turns elsewhere. Instead of seeking reassurance at home, reassurance is found outside. Over time, the partner is no longer the emotional anchor. They become the background. This doesn't feel like betrayal in the moment. It feels like relief. Relief from explaining. Relief from conflict. Relief from emotional effort. And relief is addictive. What makes attention so powerful is that it feels earned, not stolen. Physical cheating often comes with a sense of wrongdoing because it clearly violates a boundary. Emotional attention, however, feels reciprocal and innocent. We're just talking. We're just friends. They understand me. These statements are true on the surface, which is why emotional cheating is often unintentional at first. There is no conscious decision to betray, only a series of small emotional choices that slowly move intimacy away from where it belongs. Attention also reshapes self-perception. Being seen, valued, and appreciated by someone new can awaken parts of identity that feel dormant. A person may feel more interesting, more confident, more alive. That emotional uplift gets associated with the source of attention, not with the relationship. The partner becomes linked to responsibility and routine, while the other person becomes linked to emotional freedom. This contrast deepens attachment without anyone saying it out loud. Importantly, attention doesn't require availability in the traditional sense. Even brief interactions can carry intense emotional weight if the attention is focused and meaningful. A few messages a day, a shared look, or a regular check-in can create a private emotional world. That world becomes separate from the relationship, and separation is the foundation of emotional infidelity. The more emotional significance that world holds, the less space remains for intimacy at home. Attention also alters boundaries gradually. Lines that once felt firm begin to blur. Topics become more personal. Compliments become more intimate. Emotional reassurance becomes exclusive. The person starts filtering what they share with their partner, not out of malice, but to protect the emotional connection they're nurturing elsewhere. Silence replaces transparency, not because of deception, but because attention has created emotional allegiance. Another subtle effect of redirected attention is emotional defensiveness. When attention is invested elsewhere, even small questions from a partner can feel intrusive. Curiosity feels like accusation. Concern feels like control. This happens because attention carries emotional commitment, and commitment naturally seeks protection. The person may not consciously realize what they're protecting, only that they feel the need to protect something. Attention is also time-based. Emotional cheating doesn't require long hours. It requires consistent moments. The mind remembers who it checks for first, who it wants to tell things to, who it imagines reactions from. These micro-moments accumulate. Over time, emotional presence shifts. Even when physically together, part of the mind is elsewhere, replaying conversations, anticipating messages, or feeling connected to someone who isn't there. Perhaps the most misunderstood part is that attention feels like a response, not a choice. People often say they didn't mean for it to happen, and emotionally, that's true. But attention is still directed, even unconsciously. What someone feeds emotionally grows. What they neglect withers. Relationships are no exception. Emotional cheating begins the moment attention stops being shared equally and starts being invested selectively. This is why emotional cheating is often discovered not through actions, but through absence. Absence of presence. Absence of curiosity. Absence of emotional availability. The partner feels something is missing before they can identify what's wrong. That missing piece is attention, the most valuable form of intimacy, no longer fully theirs. And once attention has moved, everything else becomes easier to justify. Physical boundaries feel less sacred. Emotional distance feels more reasonable. The relationship starts to feel like an obligation rather than a choice. All of this happens without a single physical step taken, which is why emotional cheating is often far more destabilizing than physical betrayal. It shifts the heart before it ever moves the body. Behavior changes before boundaries are broken, long before a clear line is crossed, long before a moment that can be pointed to and labeled as betrayal. Something far quieter begins to shift. People rarely wake up one day and decide to violate a boundary they once respected. Instead, they move toward it slowly, almost unintentionally, guided by changes in mood, habits, and emotional responses. These changes don't announce themselves. They blend into everyday life, which is why they are so often overlooked until the damage is already done. The first changes are usually internal. A person begins to feel different, even if they can't explain why. There's a new excitement, a subtle restlessness, or a sense of emotional stimulation that wasn't there before. This internal shift then leaks outward through behavior. Tone changes, timing changes, attention patterns change. None of these behaviors are inherently wrong on their own, which is what makes them so deceptive. They look ordinary, but together they form a pattern that points toward something deeper. One of the earliest behavioral changes is emotional availability. A person may still be present, still engaged in routine interactions, but the depth feels reduced. Conversations become shorter or more surface level. Emotional responses feel delayed or distracted. It's not that they no longer care, but that their emotional resources are being divided. When someone starts processing thoughts and feelings elsewhere, there is less emotional energy left for the primary relationship, and that lack is felt before it is understood. Another subtle shift appears in communication habits. Messages are answered differently. Certain conversations happen faster, with more enthusiasm, while others feel like obligations. The difference isn't always conscious, but it's consistent. People naturally gravitate toward what feels emotionally rewarding, and behavior follows reward. When someone begins to prioritize certain interactions, even unconsciously, their behavior reorganizes around that priority. Behavior also changes in how transparency is handled. At first, nothing is hidden. It's simply not mentioned. Details are skipped. Names are avoided. Not because there's a plan to deceive, but because the person senses that full transparency would invite questions they don't want to answer yet. This selective sharing is one of the clearest signs that internal boundaries are already being tested, even if external ones remain intact. Time allocation is another early indicator. Emotional investment shows up in how time is protected. A person may suddenly need more space, more time alone, or more time on their phone. This isn't about physical absence, it's about mental presence. When someone is emotionally engaged elsewhere, their body may be in the room, but their attention is not. This partial presence creates a subtle disconnection that often feels confusing to the partner experiencing it. Behavioral changes also show up in defensiveness. When behavior no longer aligns with previously held boundaries, the mind experiences tension. To relieve that tension, people often become defensive when questioned, even gently. A simple inquiry can feel like an accusation. The defensiveness isn't about what's being asked, it's about what's being threatened. Behavior has already shifted, and the person is instinctively protecting the direction it's moving in. There is also a change in how the relationship itself is perceived and discussed. Complaints become more frequent or more internalized. Small issues feel bigger. Long-standing dynamics are suddenly reinterpreted in a more negative light. This cognitive shift serves a purpose. It helps justify the behavioral changes that are already happening. When behavior moves ahead of boundaries, the mind works to catch up by rewriting the narrative. Affection often changes before boundaries are crossed. It may not disappear, but it becomes less spontaneous. Touch feels habitual rather than intentional. Words of affirmation feel rehearsed rather than felt. This isn't always noticed immediately, but over time it creates a sense of emotional distance. Affection requires presence, and presence is harder to maintain when attention is divided. Another behavioral shift involves emotional regulation. A person may become more irritable or impatient with their partner while feeling unusually calm or energized elsewhere. This contrast isn't accidental. Emotional effort is being conserved and redirected. Where there is emotional investment, there is patience. Where there is emotional withdrawal, there is friction. Behavior reveals where the emotional center of gravity has moved. Boundaries are rarely broken in a single moment. They erode through repeated behaviors that normalize proximity and intimacy. Jokes become more personal. Conversations become more revealing. Compliments linger a little longer. Each behavior taken alone seems harmless, but together they create a new normal. Once that normal is established, crossing a boundary feels less like a leap and more like a step. Behavior also changes in anticipation. A person may start thinking about how someone else will react to news before thinking about their partner's reaction. This mental rehearsal shapes behavior. It influences what is shared, when it is shared, and with whom. Emotional anticipation is a powerful indicator of where attachment is forming, and it shows up in behavior long before any boundary is acknowledged as crossed. There is often a noticeable shift in conflict avoidance. Difficult conversations with the partner are postponed or softened, not out of kindness, but out of emotional fatigue. The person may seek emotional ease elsewhere, where there is no shared history or unresolved tension. Behavior follows the path of least emotional resistance, even if that path leads away from the relationship. Behavioral changes also appear in self-presentation. A person may become more conscious of how they appear, how they sound, or how they're perceived in certain interactions. This heightened awareness isn't necessarily about attraction, it's about emotional significance. When someone matters emotionally, behavior adjusts to maintain that connection. What makes all of this particularly dangerous is that each behavioral change can be explained away. Stress, work, personal growth, need for space. None of these explanations are false, which is why they are convincing. But the truth isn't found in any single behavior, it's found in the pattern. Behavior shifts first, boundaries follow later, and by the time a line is clearly crossed, the person has already been living on the other side of it emotionally. The partner often senses this before they can articulate it. Something feels off. The relationship feels different. But without a clear boundary violation to point to, those feelings are often dismissed or minimized. Meanwhile, behavior continues to drift, slowly redefining what is acceptable, what is normal, and what is allowed. Behavior changes before boundaries are broken because behavior is guided by emotion, not rules. Boundaries are intellectual agreements, but behavior follows feeling. When feelings begin to shift, behavior adjusts automatically. By the time boundaries are consciously crossed, they have already been weakened by countless small actions that went unnoticed or unchallenged. This is why awareness of behavioral change matters. Not to accuse, not to control, but to recognize the early signs of emotional movement. Because once behavior has fully adapted to a new emotional reality, boundaries don't break loudly. They dissolve quietly, having already lost their meaning. Defensiveness often reveals emotional misalignment, not because someone is being accused, but because something inside them is already out of alignment. When emotions, intentions, and actions no longer move in the same direction, the body reacts before the mind can fully explain it. Defensiveness is rarely about the question being asked. It is about the internal discomfort the question touches. It emerges as a protective reflex, a way to guard something fragile, conflicted, or unresolved. At its core, defensiveness is a signal. It signals that a person feels exposed, even if no exposure was intended. A simple observation, a gentle curiosity, or a neutral question can suddenly feel invasive. The emotional reaction seems disproportionate to the situation, and that imbalance is the clue. When emotional alignment is intact, questions feel safe. When it is fractured, questions feel threatening, even when they are reasonable. Emotional misalignment happens when someone's feelings begin to diverge from their commitments or values. They may still believe they are loyal, honest, and present, yet emotionally they are pulled elsewhere. This internal split creates tension. The mind wants consistency, but emotions don't always cooperate. Defensiveness becomes a way to relieve that tension without having to confront its source. Instead of examining the misalignment, the person pushes back against whatever brings it into awareness. This is why defensiveness often appears suddenly and without clear cause. There is no visible wrongdoing, no obvious boundary crossed, yet the reaction is sharp. The person may deny, deflect, minimize, or counterattack. These responses aren't calculated. They are instinctive. They arise because the emotional system senses risk. Not risk of being caught doing something wrong, but risk of being forced to acknowledge something uncomfortable. Defensiveness also reveals what matters emotionally. People don't become defensive about things they don't care about. The intensity of the reaction often corresponds to the emotional significance of what is being protected. When someone reacts strongly to a mild concern, it suggests there is more emotional weight behind the behavior than they are willing or able to admit. The defensiveness is doing the work of protection before conscious reasoning has a chance to intervene. In emotionally aligned relationships, Accountability feels possible. A person can listen, reflect, and respond without feeling attacked. In misaligned states, accountability feels dangerous. Even gentle feedback can feel like a threat to the emotional structure someone is trying to maintain. Defensiveness steps in to preserve stability, even if that stability is built on avoidance. Another aspect of defensiveness is its relationship to guilt and ambiguity. Emotional misalignment doesn't always come with clear guilt. Often, it comes with uncertainty. The person may not believe they are doing anything wrong, but they also sense that something isn't quite right. This ambiguity is uncomfortable. Defensiveness becomes a way to shut down that discomfort by externalizing it. Instead of sitting with uncertainty, the person redirects the discomfort outward. Defensiveness can also be preemptive. Sometimes it appears before any real challenge occurs. A person may assume judgment where none was expressed. They may respond to an imagined accusation rather than an actual one. This anticipatory defensiveness suggests that the person is already internally questioning their own behavior. The mind is rehearsing defenses because it senses that the current emotional trajectory may eventually require justification. Emotional misalignment often creates a heightened sensitivity to scrutiny. Behaviors that once felt normal now feel exposed. Transparency feels risky, not because of what would be revealed, but because of what it might force the person to feel. Defensiveness becomes a way to maintain emotional distance. It draws a boundary without naming it, signaling that certain areas are off-limits for exploration. There is also a relational cost to defensiveness. When one person becomes defensive, the other often becomes cautious. Conversations narrow. Curiosity is replaced by silence. Over time, this dynamic deepens the misalignment. The more defensiveness is used to protect unresolved emotions, the less space there is for honest connection. Emotional distance grows, not because of overt conflict, but because of unspoken tension. Defensiveness can masquerade as strength or confidence. It can sound firm, decisive, or assertive. But underneath, it is often rooted in vulnerability. It is a response to feeling internally unsteady. When emotional alignment is strong, vulnerability feels manageable. When it is weak, vulnerability feels dangerous, and defensiveness steps in as armor. The timing of defensiveness is also revealing. It often appears when emotional investments are shifting. As attention, attachment, or validation begins to move, the person becomes more protective of their emotional space. Questions that might redirect that attention back to the relationship feel intrusive. Defensiveness becomes a way to preserve emotional autonomy, even at the cost of intimacy. Defensiveness also alters communication patterns. Explanations become longer or more rigid. Justifications are offered before they are needed. The person may overemphasize innocence or dismiss concerns entirely. These patterns aren't about clarity, they're about control. Defensiveness seeks to control the narrative to prevent deeper examination. Importantly, defensiveness doesn't always indicate malicious intent. Often, it reflects emotional confusion. The person may be genuinely struggling to reconcile competing feelings. They may not have language for what they're experiencing. Defensiveness becomes a placeholder for emotions that haven't been processed yet. It buys time, even if that time comes at the expense of trust. From the outside, defensiveness can feel invalidating. The other person may feel unheard or dismissed. This reaction can intensify the cycle. The more one person seeks understanding, the more the other feels pressured, and the more defensive they become. Emotional misalignment deepens through this feedback loop, not because either person wants distance, but because misalignment makes closeness feel unsafe. Defensiveness also resists introspection. It turns attention outward instead of inward. Rather than asking, "Why does this bother me?" the defensive response asks, "Why are you questioning me?" This shift protects the self from uncomfortable self-examination, but it also prevents resolution. Emotional misalignment persists when it isn't examined. Over time, defensiveness can become habitual. What begins as a temporary response to internal conflict can harden into a communication style. The person learns that defensiveness stops conversations, and stopping conversations feels safer than exploring them. This habit further entrenches emotional distance, making realignment increasingly difficult. Defensiveness reveals emotional misalignment because it surfaces when internal coherence is lost. When feelings, actions, and values are aligned, there is less need for protection. Openness feels possible. When they are misaligned, even small interactions feel risky. Defensiveness becomes the language of that risk, expressing what the person cannot yet say directly. The presence of defensiveness is not proof of wrongdoing, but it is evidence of emotional strain. It points to something unresolved, something that hasn't been integrated into conscious awareness. Whether that strain leads to repair or further disconnection depends on whether the defensiveness is recognized for what it is, not an attack, but a signal that emotional alignment is slipping, and something inside is asking, quietly, urgently, to be addressed. Emotional energy is finite, and comparisons quietly reshape relationships in ways that are rarely acknowledged until the damage is already done. Every person has a limited capacity for emotional attention, patience, empathy, and presence. No matter how strong the intention or how sincere the commitment, emotional energy cannot be infinitely stretched. It flows toward what feels most rewarding, most engaging, and most emotionally stimulating at any given time. When that flow changes, relationships change with it, often without either person fully realizing what's happening. At first, the shift in emotional energy is subtle. There is no dramatic withdrawal, no sudden coldness. Instead, emotional responsiveness becomes uneven. Certain interactions feel lighter, more energizing, while others feel heavier, more draining. This isn't necessarily about love fading, it's about emotional economy. The mind and nervous system naturally conserve energy, directing it toward experiences that feel less demanding and more affirming. When someone finds that kind of emotional return in a new connection, comparisons begin to form quietly in the background. Comparisons don't usually start as judgments, they start as sensations. One interaction feels easy, another feels complicated. One conversation leaves a person feeling understood, another leaves them feeling misunderstood. These sensations accumulate, and over time, the mind starts to link emotional reward with specific people. Without conscious intention, one person becomes associated with relief and validation, while another becomes associated with effort and emotional labor. This association is powerful because it shapes behavior long before it shapes beliefs. Emotional energy follows attention, and attention follows reward. When someone begins to feel emotionally replenished by a particular connection, they naturally invest more energy there. This doesn't require deliberate choice. It happens through small moments, responding faster, listening more closely, sharing more openly. Each small investment reinforces the emotional return, creating a loop that quietly redirects emotional resources. Meanwhile, the primary relationship may begin to receive less emotional input, not out of neglect, but out of depletion. As emotional energy shifts, comparisons become more defined. The partner is no longer experienced in isolation, but in contrast. Traits that were once accepted or even appreciated begin to feel burdensome when measured against a different emotional dynamic. Familiar patterns feel stale next to novelty. Responsibilities feel heavier next to emotional freedom. These comparisons are rarely spoken aloud, but they influence perception. The relationship starts to feel less satisfying, not because it has changed, but because the emotional reference point has. What makes this process particularly insidious is that comparisons often feel objective. The mind frames them as realizations rather than reactions. I feel more heard with them. Conversations are easier. There's less conflict. These statements may be true in isolation, but they ignore context. Comparing a long-term relationship to an emotionally light connection is inherently imbalanced, yet the emotional brain rarely accounts for that. Emotional energy also affects patience. Where energy is abundant, patience follows. Where energy is scarce, irritation grows. Over time, this imbalance reshapes the emotional climate of the relationship, creating distance that feels personal but is actually energetic. Another way comparisons reshape relationships is through expectation. Emotional energy invested elsewhere raises the bar for what feels satisfying at home. The partner is unconsciously expected to provide the same emotional ease, responsiveness, or validation as someone who exists outside the responsibilities of the relationship. When that expectation isn't met, disappointment follows. The relationship is judged by a standard it cannot realistically meet, and that judgment further drains emotional energy. Emotional energy is also tied to identity. Feeling seen and valued by someone new can awaken parts of the self that feel dormant. A person may feel more interesting, more capable, or more emotionally alive in that context. This self-experience becomes part of the comparison. The partner may not just be compared to another person, but to a different version of the self. The relationship then feels limiting, not because it is, but because emotional energy elsewhere is reinforcing a more exciting self-concept. As comparisons deepen, emotional investment at home often becomes conditional. Affection, attention, and engagement may still be present, but they require more effort. The spontaneity fades. Emotional gestures become deliberate rather than instinctive. This shift is rarely intentional. It's the natural result of emotional energy being partially allocated elsewhere. The relationship begins to feel like maintenance rather than connection. The partner often senses this shift before it's articulated. Something feels off. Emotional presence feels thinner. Responses feel less engaged. These sensations can lead to increased bids for connection, which, ironically, can further strain the limited emotional energy available. The more one partner reaches out, the more overwhelmed the other may feel, deepening the energetic imbalance and reinforcing unfavorable comparisons. Comparisons also affect conflict resolution. When emotional energy is low, conflict feels more threatening. Difficult conversations are avoided or minimized. The person may seek emotional relief outside the relationship instead of working through tension within it. This avoidance reinforces the comparison. One connection feels peaceful, the other feels stressful. Over time, this dynamic can erode trust and intimacy, even if no explicit boundary is crossed. Importantly, emotional energy doesn't disappear. It is redistributed. The relationship doesn't lose energy because it is unimportant. It loses energy because that energy is being spent elsewhere. This redistribution changes the emotional math of the relationship. What once felt balanced begins to feel uneven. The partner may carry more emotional labor, while the other becomes more withdrawn, often without understanding why. Comparisons quietly reshape not just how the partner is perceived, but how the relationship itself is valued. Shared history, loyalty, and commitment may still be acknowledged intellectually, but emotionally they carry less weight than immediate emotional reward. The present feeling begins to outweigh the past investment. This shift can be deeply destabilizing, especially because it happens without a clear moment of choice. Emotional energy is finite, and when it is divided, something always receives less. Comparisons emerge as the mind tries to make sense of that division. They are not deliberate acts of betrayal, but they have real consequences. They alter perception, behavior, and emotional availability. They reshape the relationship from the inside out, long before any external line is crossed, leaving both partners feeling confused, disconnected, and unsure of how something that seemed stable began to quietly come apart. Emotional cheating reflects unmet emotional needs, not sudden betrayal. It rarely arrives as a deliberate act of disloyalty or a conscious decision to hurt someone. Instead, it develops quietly, often in the background of ordinary life, where emotional needs go unspoken, unrecognized, or unfulfilled. Most people do not seek emotional connections outside their relationships because they want to betray. They do so because something essential inside them is not being met, and they do not know how to address it directly. Emotional needs are subtle and deeply personal. They include the need to feel understood, valued, desired, emotionally safe, and psychologically connected. When these needs are consistently met within a relationship, external emotional connections tend to remain neutral. But when even one of these needs begins to go unmet over time, emotional hunger forms. That hunger doesn't always announce itself clearly. It often shows up as restlessness, irritability, or a vague sense of dissatisfaction that is difficult to articulate. What makes emotional cheating so complex is that unmet needs don't always point clearly to the relationship as the source. A person may assume the discomfort comes from stress, routine, or personal dissatisfaction. Meanwhile, an external emotional connection appears and provides relief. A conversation feels validating. Someone listens attentively. Emotional responses feel aligned and effortless. In that moment, the unmet need is temporarily satisfied, and the relief feels significant. This relief is often mistaken for chemistry or fate, but it is more accurately emotional nourishment. When someone feels emotionally fed after a long period of emotional scarcity, the contrast is powerful. The mind begins to associate the external person with fulfillment and the relationship with deprivation. This association forms without conscious intent, and once it takes root, it influences behavior, attention, and emotional investment. Importantly, unmet emotional needs are not always the result of a neglectful partner. Life circumstances, stress, unresolved conflicts, and unhealed personal patterns all play a role. Sometimes partners care deeply but lack the tools or awareness to meet each other's evolving emotional needs. Over time, small disconnects accumulate. Conversations become transactional. Emotional check-ins become infrequent. Vulnerability feels risky or unrewarded. These conditions create emotional gaps, and emotional gaps invite alternative sources of connection. Emotional cheating often begins with feeling seen. Being truly seen is a powerful emotional experience. When someone notices nuances, remembers details, and responds with empathy, it fulfills a fundamental human need. If that experience is missing at home, even unintentionally, the emotional impact of receiving it elsewhere can feel profound. The person may not think, "I am betraying my partner." They think, "I finally feel understood." Another common unmet need is emotional safety. In some relationships, vulnerability has become associated with conflict, criticism, or dismissal. Sharing feelings may feel like opening the door to judgment rather than support. When an external connection offers non-judgmental listening and acceptance, it becomes a refuge. Emotional cheating grows in spaces where vulnerability feels safer outside the relationship than within it. Unmet needs also involve appreciation and validation. Over time, partners may stop expressing admiration or gratitude, assuming it is understood. But emotional validation requires renewal. When someone else recognizes effort, intelligence, or emotional depth that goes unnoticed at home, it can awaken a sense of worth that has been dormant. That validation is not about ego, it is about identity. Feeling valued reinforces a person's sense of self, and when that reinforcement comes from outside the relationship, attachment begins to shift. Emotional cheating is also shaped by avoidance. Addressing unmet needs requires difficult conversations, vulnerability, and the risk of conflict or rejection. For many, it feels safer to seek emotional fulfillment quietly than to confront issues directly. The external emotional connection becomes a coping mechanism, a way to meet needs without facing discomfort. This avoidance doesn't stem from cruelty, it stems from fear. Over time, the external emotional connection begins to carry emotional significance. The person may feel calmer, happier, or more understood after interacting with the other person. These emotional responses reinforce the behavior, creating a cycle. Meanwhile, the relationship continues without addressing the underlying unmet needs, allowing the emotional gap to widen. Unmet emotional needs also influence perception of the relationship. The partner may begin to feel emotionally distant or unsupportive, even if they have not changed. This perception isn't entirely false. It reflects the emotional experience of unmet needs. However, it is shaped by comparison. The emotional ease of the external connection highlights the emotional strain within the relationship, making the contrast more pronounced. It is important to recognize that unmet needs are not static. They evolve as individuals grow and change. A relationship that once met all emotional needs may no longer do so without adjustment. Emotional cheating often emerges during periods of personal transition, when emotional needs shift faster than the relationship adapts. This understanding does not excuse emotional cheating, but it contextualizes it. Viewing it as sudden betrayal oversimplifies a complex emotional process. Emotional cheating is the outcome of unresolved emotional hunger, combined with avoidance and opportunity. It reflects a breakdown in emotional communication more than a lack of moral character. The painful truth is that emotional cheating often signals something that has been missing for a long time. Not love, but emotional nourishment. When that nourishment is not restored within the relationship, people seek it where it is available. The betrayal is not in the need itself, but in the silence that allows that need to be met elsewhere, rather than addressed where it belongs. Emotional distance often shows up as silence, not conflict. It is one of the most overlooked and misunderstood signals in relationships because humans are conditioned to equate problems with loud arguments, dramatic fights, or visible acts of disloyalty. People tend to believe that if someone is emotionally disengaged, it must be obvious through anger, complaints, or tension. But emotional distance rarely announces itself in such an explicit way. Instead, it manifests quietly, subtly, almost imperceptibly, through a lack of expression, a reduction in responsiveness, and a withdrawal from meaningful engagement. The silence is not emptiness. It is communication in itself, a signal of a shift in priorities and attachments that often goes unnoticed until it is profound. Silence begins slowly. It does not appear overnight. Conversations that were once effortless become sparse. A person may still be present physically, sitting across the table or lying in the same bed, yet their engagement is diminished. They may nod, smile, or answer questions, but the depth of connection, the exchange of thoughts, feelings, and dreams, is gone. This absence is subtle, and because there is no drama, it is easy to dismiss. The partner may assume that the other is tired, stressed, or distracted. In reality, emotional distance is forming. The first manifestation of this silence is often conversational avoidance. Topics that once elicited shared reflection, curiosity, or intimate disclosure are now skirted or glossed over. Questions about feelings, plans, or experiences that previously sparked dialogue are met with brief, non-committal answers. The tone is polite, but it lacks curiosity or engagement. A fine or okay becomes a placeholder for the more detailed response that used to exist. This is not dishonesty. It is withdrawal. It signals that the mind and heart are elsewhere, not invested in exploring the depths of shared life as they once were. Alongside avoidance, there is often a reduction in emotional responsiveness. Laughter becomes less frequent, smiles feel more fleeting, and enthusiasm for shared experiences diminishes. Where there was once spontaneous joy in small interactions, a shared joke, a story, a glance, there is now quiet. The absence is felt more than it is seen, and the subtlety makes it deceptive. Emotional distance does not yell, it whispers. It whispers in delayed responses to messages, in missed cues during conversations, in lack of follow-up on plans or promises. It whispers in the absence of shared dreams, leaving the relationship feeling like parallel lines moving in the same space, but no longer converging. Silence as a manifestation of distance is also reinforced by selective engagement. The person who is emotionally drifting may still participate in surface-level activities. They may attend social gatherings, manage household responsibilities, or engage in small talk. These actions give the appearance of normalcy and mask the underlying emotional shift. To an outside observer, everything appears functional. To the partner experiencing it, however, the absence of deeper engagement is palpable. Emotional presence is not about being physically available. It is about the alignment of attention, interest, and care. When attention is withdrawn, even without words, distance forms. Interestingly, emotional distance is often accompanied by hyper-vigilant silence. This occurs when the person feels a conflict between loyalty and curiosity, desire and commitment, or comfort and guilt. They may subconsciously withdraw to protect themselves from confronting these conflicting feelings. In this way, silence becomes a defense mechanism. It is not an attack, it is a shield. The person may still interact in daily life, but their emotional energy is guarded. The moments they do engage feel measured, controlled, or perfunctory. This silent regulation prevents the partner from detecting the full extent of the drift until it has progressed. The phenomenon of silence over conflict also affects how the partner responds. Many people interpret a lack of arguments as a sign of harmony. They believe that if nothing is being fought about, everything must be fine. But silence is often not peace. It is avoidance. Avoidance of uncomfortable conversations, avoidance of vulnerability, and avoidance of emotional confrontation. In a healthy relationship, difficult conversations occur because both partners feel emotionally safe. In relationships where emotional distance is growing, silence replaces conversation. Discomfort is suppressed, curiosity is muted, and connection diminishes quietly. Another critical aspect of silence as emotional distance is that it often masks comparison. The mind is highly attuned to emotional reward, and when attention or validation is found elsewhere, the person may unconsciously reserve emotional engagement for that other connection. When they return to the primary relationship, their presence may be perfunctory, their words minimal. There is no loud betrayal, no confrontation, no dramatic scene. Instead, the silence is weighted with subtle comparison. The partner becomes measured against the external emotional experience, often unfavorably. This silent evaluation intensifies emotional distance because the partner feels invisible or insufficient without ever being accused. Silence also reshapes intimacy. Emotional cheating or emotional drifting often begins not with grand gestures or physical acts, but with the gradual retreat from meaningful exchange. Emotional intimacy thrives on reciprocal sharing of thoughts, feelings, fears, and desires. When one partner retreats, the other notices a vacuum. Attempts to bridge the gap are often met with minimal responses or polite acknowledgement. Over time, the act of sharing becomes fraught with the anticipation of indifference. Emotional withdrawal changes the very architecture of intimacy because the unspoken absence replaces engagement. One of the most challenging aspects of this silence is its invisibility. Partners experiencing distance often struggle to articulate what they feel. They notice the absence of energy, attention, or connection, but cannot name a specific event. Unlike a shouting match or a fight over clear disagreements, emotional silence does not leave a trace of wrongdoing or a moment to point to. It is a process rather than an incident. This makes it difficult to address because people tend to respond to problems with visible markers, words, actions, or behaviors that are out of alignment. When the distance is silent, the markers are internal and relational, not external. Behaviorally, silence manifests in several ways. Response times may slow, the person may avoid initiating contact, physical gestures that once communicated warmth or affection may diminish, eye contact may be fleeting, and conversational investment minimal. Topics may be changed quickly to avoid emotional depth. Even shared plans may feel like obligations rather than sources of connection. Each of these behaviors is subtle, yet collectively they form a pattern that indicates emotional drift. The partner may notice small inconsistencies, but struggle to connect them into a coherent picture. Silence is particularly insidious because it creates feedback loops. The partner senses emotional withdrawal and may respond with attempts to re-engage, asking questions, seeking closeness, or expressing concern. These attempts, however well-intentioned, can feel intrusive to someone already retreating emotionally. The withdrawal deepens, the silence extends, and emotional gaps widen. Over time, what began as a small, barely perceptible change grows into a structural feature of the relationship. Emotional absence becomes normalized, even though it is experienced as pain or frustration by the partner. In addition to creating relational gaps, silence affects internal experience. The person withdrawing emotionally may feel relief in avoiding confrontation or difficult emotional labor. They may also feel guilt, anxiety, or tension, which reinforces the guarded behavior. The partner experiencing the silence may feel confusion, rejection, or insecurity, which intensifies their own emotional responses. These contrasting internal experiences amplify the relational distance, all without a single overt conflict occurring. Silence as a signal of emotional distance also interacts with time. The longer it persists, the more entrenched it becomes. Moments of engagement become rarer and more transactional. The emotional rhythm of the relationship shifts from dynamic and reciprocal to measured and superficial. Attention is given sparingly, affection becomes routine rather than spontaneous, and curiosity is muted. Over time, these patterns can mimic the experience of betrayal without any explicit transgression, because the absence itself communicates disengagement and preference for emotional distance. It is important to recognize that silence often accompanies selective openness. The emotionally distant person may still speak at length or display warmth in certain contexts, particularly where there is no emotional risk or in interactions with others outside the relationship. This selective communication reinforces the invisibility of the drift. The partner may notice moments of normalcy and assume that all is well, while the overall pattern of withdrawal continues undetected. Silence becomes intermittent, strategically placed to protect emotional comfort while avoiding meaningful engagement. Silence also reveals shifts in priority. Emotional energy is finite, and where it is invested determines the quality of connection. When attention is redirected, even subtly, toward other sources of validation or stimulation, silence manifests at home. Topics, concerns, and shared experiences are met with minimal engagement because the person's emotional bandwidth is being spent elsewhere. This creates a paradox. The partner is physically present, relational structures remain intact, but emotionally, they are increasingly peripheral. One of the most dangerous aspects of emotional distance showing up as silence is its effect on long-term perception. Partners experiencing silence may begin to internalize it as personal inadequacy. They may question their worth, their desirability, or their role in the relationship. The silent withdrawal communicates something powerful. Engagement is conditional, availability is optional, and emotional connection is not guaranteed. These messages are absorbed subconsciously, often leaving the partner feeling confused, anxious, or frustrated without a clear source for those feelings. Silence also changes the meaning of shared routines. Activities that once reinforced connection, watching a movie together, sharing meals, casual conversations, lose their emotional weight. They continue physically, but the emotional impact is diminished. The absence of shared emotional processing transforms these routines into placeholders rather than bonding experiences. Over time, the relationship begins to feel like two individuals coexisting rather than truly connecting. The quiet nature of this emotional distance often makes it self-reinforcing. Attempts to address the issue may be met with defensiveness or minimization, which further discourages engagement. The partner may begin to mirror the silence, either out of frustration or resignation. Emotional feedback loops of withdrawal, misunderstanding, and muted responses take hold. What begins as a subtle absence of words becomes a structural feature of the relationship, reinforcing emotional separation without any dramatic conflict. Silence, as emotional distance, is particularly relevant in the context of emotional cheating. It is often the first visible sign that attention and attachment are moving elsewhere. Conversations, responsiveness, and presence before any overt betrayal occurs. The mind and heart begin to invest elsewhere, and the quiet disengagement at home signals that shift. The absence of conflict is deceptive. It is not harmony, but an emotional vacuum. The louder the silence, the more profound the disconnection. Ultimately, emotional distance showing up as silence is a complex interplay of avoidance, energy allocation, and relational prioritization. It communicates withdrawal without aggression, disengagement without confrontation, and absence without physical departure. Silence is not emptiness. It is presence reshaped. It is the most understated yet most potent indicator that a relationship is moving into a new emotional reality, one where connection has been quietly redistributed long before anyone shouts, argues, or explicitly steps outside the boundaries of the partnership. What's hidden isn't the person, but the emotional reliance. When people think of betrayal, they often imagine physical acts, secret encounters, or obvious lies. They picture a person sneaking around, hiding meetings, or breaking promises. But in emotional cheating, the real secrecy is rarely about where someone goes or what they do. The hidden truth is about where their heart and mind go first, the source they instinctively turn to for comfort, validation, and understanding. Emotional reliance is invisible. It cannot be measured by attendance, words, or visible actions. It is the unseen gravity that pulls a person towards someone else, and it is far more powerful than any act of physical infidelity because it alters the very architecture of attachment. Emotional reliance begins quietly, often without conscious awareness. A person does not wake up intending to shift their dependence from one relationship to another. It starts with small emotional gratifications. Someone else listening more attentively, offering support without judgment, responding in ways that make a person feel understood or appreciated. These moments feel good. They feel safe. They feel necessary. Over time, they build a pattern of reliance that the person may not even recognize. The attraction is less about the individual and more about what that person provides emotionally: connection, reassurance, and affirmation. This reliance is cumulative. Every conversation that feels validating, every interaction that brings relief or emotional satisfaction, strengthens the habit of turning elsewhere for emotional needs. The mind begins to anticipate that certain feelings will be met outside the primary relationship. A person may find themselves mentally rehearsing interactions with someone else, seeking their advice, or imagining how they will respond to news or challenges before they even share them with their partner. These thoughts are subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but they gradually form a pattern of dependency. The partner may not see what is happening, but the heart has already begun to divide its allegiance. One of the key aspects of emotional reliance is that it is often unconscious. People rarely admit to themselves that they are turning first to someone else for emotional support. They may rationalize it as casual friendship, professional mentorship, or harmless camaraderie. They may believe they are still loyal, present, and committed. Yet emotional reliance does not require intention to exist. It grows organically as the person's needs find satisfaction outside the primary relationship. The danger lies not in conscious deceit, but in the subtle shift of attachment, which changes priorities and alters behavior without overt recognition. The consequences of this hidden reliance are profound because it reshapes how the person experiences intimacy, vulnerability, and emotional safety. When a person depends on someone else for reassurance or understanding, even partially, the primary relationship begins to feel less sufficient. Emotional labor that once felt shared begins to feel heavier. Attempts to connect may feel less rewarding or more draining. Affection, empathy, and patience at home require more effort because the person's emotional reserves are being partially invested elsewhere. The partner may feel the difference without understanding its cause, experiencing subtle rejection, frustration, or confusion. Emotional reliance also influences decision-making and emotional regulation. People naturally seek the path that provides the most psychological comfort with the least emotional cost. When an external source consistently offers ease, reassurance, or validation, the mind begins to favor it. Difficult conversations, conflicts, or emotional discomfort with the partner may be deferred or avoided, not out of malice, but because the emotional safety that is sought is found elsewhere. This avoidance creates a widening gap. Emotional reliance becomes a quiet form of sheltering, where one's needs are met without facing the vulnerabilities inherent in the primary relationship. Emotional reliance also changes the perception of the partner. When validation, understanding, or support is consistently received from someone else, the primary relationship begins to feel inadequate, even when the partner is loving, attentive, and present. This is not necessarily a judgment of character. It is a reflection of relative emotional fulfillment. Emotional reliance creates comparison, whether conscious or unconscious. The heart measures what is received elsewhere against what is available at home, subtly shifting expectations and altering emotional satisfaction. Over time, emotional reliance reshapes attachment patterns. The person may become more reactive or disengaged in the primary relationship because the external source provides a more reliable emotional anchor. Conflicts or disappointments at home feel heavier, while minor joys outside feel amplified. The relational dynamics are affected before any overt betrayal occurs because attachment has partially migrated. The hidden reliance changes priorities, subtly redirecting attention, care, and investment without any dramatic declaration. One of the most insidious aspects of emotional reliance is that it often coexists with genuine love for the partner. A person may still deeply care, still feel loyalty, and still desire connection. Yet emotional fulfillment is being sourced elsewhere, which creates a duality. The partner is loved, but the heart is partially dependent on another. This duality is difficult to confront because it challenges the traditional narrative of fidelity. The reliance is not a conscious rejection. It is a quiet realignment of emotional needs, occurring without malice or awareness. Emotional reliance also manifests in subtle behavioral changes. Conversations with the partner may feel transactional, affectionate gestures may become routine, and shared experiences may lose spontaneity. Attention may be divided, even if no one notices. Responses may be slower or less engaged. These behaviors are not always intentional, but reflect the internal shift in emotional investment. The person is physically present, but their heart has already established a parallel anchor. This parallel attachment is the hidden dimension of emotional reliance. The longer emotional reliance continues, the more entrenched it becomes. Habits of thought, emotional anticipation, and internal dialogue reinforce the pattern. A person may find themselves imagining how the external source will react to news, or sharing first with them before turning to their partner. They may seek emotional validation or reassurance elsewhere for challenges that could be discussed at home. These habits are automatic and internalized, making them invisible to both partners while significantly shaping relational dynamics. Emotional reliance also interacts with conflict. Because the external source provides predictable validation or understanding, the person may avoid addressing difficult topics at home. They may withdraw from emotionally charged conversations or defer sharing thoughts and feelings to prevent discomfort. This avoidance reduces intimacy and reinforces the hidden dependency. Emotional distance is not created by confrontation, but by the subtle rerouting of attachment, which occurs silently and invisibly over time. Another critical aspect is that emotional reliance can distort perception of self. When a person repeatedly receives affirmation and understanding from someone outside the primary relationship, their self-concept becomes partially entwined with that source. They may feel more confident, more understood, or more validated after interaction with the external person than with their partner. This psychological reinforcement strengthens the dependency, making the hidden reliance increasingly integral to their emotional well-being. Emotional reliance is often cyclical. The more needs are met externally, the more the primary relationship feels insufficient, which increases internal tension. This tension encourages continued reliance on the external source, reinforcing withdrawal from the partner. The cycle is invisible because it is internal. No rules are broken, no physical betrayals occur, yet the relationship is being reshaped from within. The hidden reliance becomes the central emotional fulcrum, quietly shifting attachment and connection. Importantly, emotional reliance is not inherently malicious or intentional. It is a natural human response to unmet needs and accessible emotional resources. People naturally seek emotional safety, validation, and understanding, and when these needs are absent in one context and present in another, the mind and heart gravitate toward what satisfies them. This gravitation does not require conscious decision-making, yet it has real consequences because it reallocates emotional energy and reshapes relational dynamics. Finally, emotional reliance highlights the central truth of emotional betrayal. What matters most is not the act of being with someone else, but where the heart turns first. Even in the absence of physical or overt betrayal, the hidden dependence reshapes priorities, perceptions, and attachments. It changes where energy flows, where attention lands, and where emotional investment is placed. The person may still love their partner, still feel loyal, and still honor commitments, yet the hidden reliance quietly undermines the foundation of intimacy and reshapes the emotional landscape of the relationship.